Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a really intense dozen years in the U.S., 1848 to 1860. This is when the arguments over slavery just escalated dramatically.
Right, things really started to spiral. And our mission here isn't just to list dates and events, we want to dig into why.
Yeah, what were the real drivers? We'll look at the politics, the laws, the social movements.
The cultural shifts, too, all the things pushing the country towards, well, towards the edge. We've analyzed a lot of historical accounts, legislative records, that sort of thing.
And what's fascinating, I think, is seeing all these attempts at compromise. They keep trying to patch things up.
And they keep failing. It's like watching this slow, inevitable march toward conflict. It's quite something.
Okay, let's dive in. The Mexican War ends. The U.S. gets this huge chunk of new land, the Mexican Cession. That immediately creates a massive problem, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A fundamental problem. Suddenly you have all this new territory, California, New Mexico, Utah, and the question is unavoidable. Will slavery be allowed there?
It forces the issue right out into the open.
Exactly. Before, it was simmering, but this threw gasoline on the fire.
Which leads us straight to the Wilmot Proviso. What was that about?
David Wilmot, a congressman, proposed that slavery should be banned in any territory acquired from Mexico. Simple proposal, really.
The hugely controversial.
Immensely. It passed the House a couple of times, where the North had more population, but it always failed in the Senate. For Northerners opposed to slavery's spread, it was a clear statement.
And with the South.
A direct attack. They saw it as blocking their future, limiting their economic system, and, crucially, their political weight in Washington. Its failure just highlighted how deep the division already was.
So if banning slavery outright wasn't going to fly, what other ideas were floated?
Well, the main alternative that gained traction was this idea called popular sovereignty.
Okay. And Lewis Cass was a big proponent.
Yes, Lewis Cass, a Democratic senator, later a presidential candidate, he really pushed this idea.
So what did popular sovereignty actually mean in practice?
The core idea was, well, let the people who actually live in the territory decide for themselves. Let the settlers vote on whether to allow slavery or not.
It sounds democratic on the surface. Let the people choose.
That was the appeal. It seemed like a compromise, a way to take the decision out of Congress's hands and avoid a direct North-South confrontation. Appease both sides, maybe?
But it had a fatal flaw, didn't it?
It did. The big one was that it opened the door for slavery to potentially expand anywhere. For anti-slavery Northerners, that was simply unacceptable. Plus, it was vague. When do they decide? How? It just kicked the can down the road and, as we'll see, created chaos later.
Right. Okay, this is the backdrop for the election of 1848. Who's running and how's slavery figuring in?
The Whigs go with Zachary Taylor. He's a war hero from the Mexican War, a Louisiana slave owner, but he was surprisingly quiet on the slavery issue itself during the campaign.
Trying to be all things to all people.
Pretty much. His fame was the main selling point. But the really interesting thing in 48 is the rise of the Free Soil Party.
Ah, yes, the Free Soilers. What was their platform?
It was a mix of people, anti-slavery Democrats, anti-slavery Whigs, folks from the old Liberty Party. Their slogan tells you a lot. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men.
So definitely focused on stopping slavery's expansion.
Exactly. No slavery in the territories. They also push for things like federal money for internal improvements, free homesteads for settlers heading west.
And they had a former president running for them.
They did. Martin Van Buren didn't win, of course, but it showed this anti-slavery coalition was becoming a real political force. You can really see the seeds of the Republican Party here.
How did the election turn out? Taylor won.
Taylor won, yes. The Free Soilers didn't carry any states, but they pulled enough votes, especially in New York, to arguably cost Cass the election. They showed that anti-slavery was a motivated voting bloc.
Okay, let's fast forward just a tiny bit. Gold is discovered in California, the gold rush. That throws another wrench in the works, right?
A massive wrench. Suddenly, in 1848, 1849, you have this huge influx of people, the 49ers, rushing to California. The population explodes almost overnight.
Way faster than anyone expected.
Far faster. And they need government. They need order. So, very quickly, by 1849, California drafts a constitution.
And crucially,
that constitution banned slavery. And then they applied directly for statehood, skipping the whole territorial phase.
which panicked the South. Why?
Because of the Senate. Up to that point, there was an exact balance. 15 free states, 15 slave states. Admitting California as a free state would tip that balance, giving the North a majority in the Senate for the first time.
A major threat to Southern power.
A fundamental threat. It bypassed popular sovereignty, too, denying them a chance to even try establishing slavery there.
So let's set the scene in 1850.
Yeah.
What's the overall balance of power looking like? The South seems to have some advantages on paper.
They did. In 1850, they had the president, Taylor, a Southerner, a majority in the cabinet, a majority on the Supreme Court. And that Senate balance, that 15-15 split, gave them veto power over legislation they hated.
But underneath, they were deeply worried.
Very worried. California was the immediate threat. But they also looked at New Mexico and Utah, the other territories from Mexico, and thought, those probably won't become slave states either. Climate, geography, not suited for plantation agriculture.
Plus other ongoing issues.
Right. There was a nasty border dispute between Texas and New Mexico, constant calls from abolitionists to ban slavery in Washington, D.C., and then there's the whole issue of runaway slaves.
Which was becoming a bigger and bigger flashpoint.
Yes. All this fueled a deep sense of anxiety in the South, a fear that their way of life, their political influence, was slipping away.
And this is when we start hearing more from the real hardliners, the fire eaters.
Exactly. These were the radical Southerners who were already saying, look, the Union isn't protecting us anymore. Secession might be the only answer. They started talking openly about leaving the Union if California came in free. The crisis was real.
Let's talk more about the runaway slave issue. The Underground Railroad. What was its real impact?
It was this network, mostly informal but incredibly brave, of free Black people, abolitionists, Quakers, helping enslaved people escape north, usually to Canada.
Figures like Harriet Tubman became legends.
Absolutely. Moses, they called her. She supposedly made about 19 trips back into the South, guiding around 300 people to freedom. Incredible courage. And others like Jerry Logan in Syracuse helped hundreds more.
But the numbers weren't huge overall.
Compared to the total enslaved population, no. Maybe 1,000 successful escapes a year. Estimates vary, but the symbolism was huge.
And the legal side was messy, too.
Very. There was an old Fugitive Slave Act from 1793, but it wasn't very effective. Then the Supreme Court case, Prigg v. Pennsylvania in 1842, said state officials didn't have to help return fugitives, making it a federal job.
And northern states responded how?
Many passed personal liberty laws. These aimed to make it harder to capture alleged fugitives, guaranteeing things like jury trials, hindering state cooperation.
Which infuriated the South.
Completely. They saw it as the North actively undermining their constitutional property rights. Even if the number of escapees wasn't catastrophic, it was the principle. They demanded a much stronger federal law to force the return of escaped slaves. It became a non-negotiable demand by 1850.
Okay, so the stage is set. Crisis point. Enter the great triumvirate for one last attempt at compromise.
Yes, the giants of the Senate. Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the fierce defender of Southern rights, though he was ailing. And Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the great orator of union.
Clay steps up with a plan.
He does. Proposes a big package deal, an omnibus bill trying to give something to both sides. California comes in free, that's for the North, but a much tougher fugitive slave law, that's for the South.
What else was in there?
Settling the Texas border dispute, organizing New Mexico and Utah territories with popular sovereignty to decide slavery later, and abolishing the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in Washington, D.C.
A real balancing act. And Stephen Douglas, a younger senator then, he was involved too.
Very involved. Douglas, the little giant from Illinois, was key in actually maneuvering the pieces of the compromise through Congress later on. Clay laid out the vision.
But it wasn't universally loved. Calhoun's reaction.
Calhoun was dying, literally had his final speech read for him. He rejected Clay's compromise outright. He argued it wasn't enough to protect the South. He demanded guarantees, constitutional amendments to protect slavery, restore the sectional balance, basically things the North would never accept.
And Webster. His position caused a stir.
It certainly did. Webster, in his famous 7th of March speech, shocked many in the North by supporting Clay's compromise, including the stricter fugitive slave law.
Why did he do that?
He argued it was necessary to save the Union. He also argued, somewhat controversially, that climate and geography meant slavery wouldn't take root in the new territories anyway, so banning it wasn't necessary. He pleaded for reconciliation.
How did that go down in the North?
Abolitionists were furious. They saw it as a betrayal. Webster caving to the slave power. But it probably did persuade some moderate Northerners that compromise was the only way to avoid immediate disaster.
And there were voices arguing against any compromise, right? Like William Seward.
Yes, Senator Seward from New York. He gave a famous speech arguing against compromise, appealing to a higher law than the Constitution, a moral law that condemned slavery. He represented a more radical, younger generation of Northern politicians less willing to concede.
And President Taylor himself wasn't keen on compromise initially.
No, Taylor seemed to be leaning towards Seward's view. He was against concessions, even threatened to lead the army himself if Texas tried to seize territory from New Mexico. Some think if he hadn't died, the confrontation might have happened right then, in 1850.
But Taylor did die suddenly.
Yes, in July 1850. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, took over. Fillmore was much more open to compromise.
And that opened the door.
It did. With Fillmore's support, and Stephen Douglas breaking Clay's omnibus bill into individual pieces of legislation, they managed to pass each part separately. That package became the Compromise of 1850.
So let's recap the key parts again. California free.
California admitted free. Slave trade banned in D.C. Popular sovereignty for New Mexico and Utah territories. Texas paid $10 million to give up its land claims. And crucially...
The new, much tougher fugitive slave law.
Exactly. The one the South had demanded.
Looking back, who got the better deal in the long run?
Most historians argue the North did. California tipped the Senate balance. New Mexico and Utah were unlikely to become slave states anyway. The D.C. slave trade ban was a symbolic win.
But that fugitive slave law?
That was the poison pill. It turned out to be incredibly inflammatory in the North.
Why was it so much worse than the old one?
It denied accused fugitives the right to testify, denied them a jury trial. Federal commissioners got paid more for returning someone to slavery than for freeing them, and it compelled ordinary citizens in the North to assist in captures.
So it forced Northerners to be complicit.
Yes. Many saw it as immoral, outrageous. It got nicknamed the Bloodhound Bill. Abolitionist sentiment surged. Northern states passed even stronger personal liberty laws trying to obstruct it. The Supreme Court case, Abelman v. Booth, eventually upheld the federal law, but Northern resistance didn't stop. It deepened the sectional rift immensely.
There's an argument, though, that the compromise, even with its flaws, bought time.
A very strong argument. It delayed secession for a decade. In that decade, the North's industrial strength grew, its population grew, and perhaps most importantly, Northern public opinion solidified more around preserving the Union, even if it meant fighting. In 1850, the North might not have been ready or unified enough. That decade was crucial.
Okay, moving past the compromise. The election of 1852, what happened there?
The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce. He was a Northerner from New Hampshire, but seen as very friendly to Southern interests, a doughface, they called them. He strongly endorsed the compromise, including the fugitive slave law.
And the Whigs.
The Whigs were falling apart. They nominated another war hero, General Winfield Scott. But the party was hopelessly split over the fugitive slave law. Anti-slavery Whigs couldn't stomach it. Southern Whigs didn't trust Scott.
So Pierce won easily.
Decisively. The Whig Party basically collapsed after this election. It was a major political realignment. And significantly, both Clay and Webster died in 1852, removing two major figures associated with national unity and compromise.
Pierce's presidency saw a real push for expansion, didn't it? Manifest destiny wasn't dead.
Not at all. There was interest in Central America, especially potential canal routes. The U.S. and Britain actually agreed to joint control over any future canal in the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, trying to cool tensions there.
And further afield.
Asia. Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition sailed into Tokyo Bay in 1853, forcing Japan to open up to trade. That was a big moment.
But the real expansionist desire, especially for the South, was closer to home, Cuba.
Yes. Cuba was the dream for many Southerners, a rich slave territory that could potentially be carved into several new slave states, restoring Southern power in the Senate.
But attempts to get it were clumsy, to say the least.
Very clumsy. There were these private, illegal military expeditions, filibustering, trying to seize parts of Cuba or Nicaragua, mostly failing. Then Spain seized an American ship, the Black Warrior, in 1854, which briefly raised war fever.
And the Ostend Manifesto, that was particularly notorious.
Oh, yeah. 3 American diplomats met secretly in Ostend, Belgium, and basically wrote a memo saying the U.S. should offer Spain $120 million for Cuba, and if Spain refused, we'd be justified in just taking it.
When that leaked.
Huge backlash in the North. It looked like a naked plot to expand slavery by force. Pierce had to disavow it. Any chance of acquiring Cuba peacefully or otherwise was dead after that embarrassment.
Amidst all that, there was a more practical land deal. The Gadsden Purchase. Why did that happen?
Railroads. Everyone wanted a transcontinental railroad to connect California and the West Coast. The question was, where should it run, north or south?
And the South wanted a southern route.
Exactly. But the best terrain for a southern route, south of the Gila River, was actually still in Mexico. So in 1853, the U.S. paid Mexico $10 million for that strip of land parts of modern Arizona and New Mexico.
It seemed to make the Southern Railroad route more likely.
It definitely strengthened the South's case, but it also lit a fire under Northerners who wanted a northern route. And to build a northern route, you needed the territory west of Missouri and Iowa to be organized. That territory was called Nebraska.
Ah, setting the stage for the next big explosion.
Precisely. The push to organize Nebraska leads directly to Stephen Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Right, this one is huge. What was Douglas trying to achieve?
Douglas, senator from Illinois, wanted that transcontinental railroad for the North, specifically with Chicago as the eastern hub. Good for his state, good for his own investments. To get Southern support for organizing Nebraska, he needed to offer them something.
And that something was
Popular sovereignty. He proposed splitting the vast Nebraska territory into two, Kansas and Nebraska, and letting the settlers in each decide on slavery for themselves.
But wait, hadn't the Missouri Compromise already dealt with that area?
It had. Both Kansas and Nebraska were north of the 36-degree 30-minute line, where slavery had been banned since 1820. So Douglas's bill explicitly repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise.
Opening up lands that had been considered free for decades to the possibility of slavery.
Exactly. The implicit understanding was that Nebraska to the north would probably become free, and Kansas, next to slave state Missouri, might become slave. The South loved it. President Pierce, under heavy Southern pressure, eventually backed it.
And the Northern reaction.
Absolute fury. Betrayal. The Missouri Compromise was seen by many Northerners as almost sacred, a binding agreement. Douglas completely misjudged how deep the anti-slavery sentiment had become. He thought the lure of westward expansion would overcome the objections. He was wrong.
What were the immediate results of the act passing?
It blew everything up. Northern resistance to the fugitive slave law intensified. The abolitionist movement got a massive shot in the arm. Southerners got angry when the North didn't just step aside and let Kansas go slave.
It destroyed old compromises.
Utterly wrecked them. The compromises of 1820 and 1850 were now basically meaningless in the territories. The Democratic Party started splitting badly along north-south lines.
And its biggest legacy, perhaps.
The birth of the Republican Party. It formed almost immediately, directly in response to Kansas-Nebraska. A coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, free soilers, all united by wanting to stop the expansion of slavery.
This is when Lincoln comes back into the picture, too.
Yes, Abraham Lincoln had been out of national politics for a bit, but Kansas-Nebraska brought him roaring back as a leading voice against Douglas and against slavery's spread. And importantly, this new Republican Party had zero support in the South. It was purely sectional. Many historians see the Kansas-Nebraska Act as the single most important step towards the Civil War.
Alongside the political battles, anti-slavery literature was having a huge impact on public opinion, wasn't it?
Immense impact. You absolutely have to talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Published in 1852, what was its effect?
It was a phenomenon, sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the U.S., millions worldwide eventually. Stowe wrote it out of religious conviction and outrage over the fugitive slave law. She wanted to show slavery's cruelty, especially how it destroyed families, to make people feel its immorality.
And it worked.
It worked incredibly well in the North. It personalized slavery, made it real and emotional for people who might have been indifferent before. It fueled abolitionism like nothing else. Lincoln's famous, possibly apocryphal, quote when meeting her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," captures its perceived power.
How was it received in the South?
Utter condemnation. Banned, denounced as lies and distortions. It just deepened the sense of being under attack.
There was another book around this time, taking a very different angle, right? Hinton Helper.
Yes, Hinton Rowan Helper's The Impending Crisis of the South, from 1857. Helper was actually a white Southerner from North Carolina, but not from the planter class.
And his argument was?
He used statistics, census data, to argue that slavery actually harmed the South's economy and held back the majority of non-slaveholding white Southerners. He claimed it impoverished them, stifled progress.
So an economic argument against slavery aimed at Southern whites.
Exactly. But he couldn't even get it published in the South. It came out in the North. While some poorer whites might have agreed privately, it was mostly ignored or banned in the South. The planter elite hated it.
But it found an audience elsewhere.
Oh, yes. The Republicans actually circulated a condensed version as campaign material in the North, which predictably infuriated the South even more. It became another symbol of Northern interference and misunderstanding.
Okay, back to Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passes. Settlers pour in, and it gets violent. Bleeding Kansas.
Bleeding Kansas is right. Both sides rushed settlers in. Anti-slavery groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Company helped thousands move there. They weren't all pacifists either. Some came armed.
Beecher's Bibles.
That's the term, yeah. Rifles supposedly shipped in boxes marked Bibles. Henry Ward Beecher, a famous preacher and Harriet's brother, supposedly supported it. This influx angered Southerners who felt the North was cheating at popular sovereignty.
And pro-slavery forces retaliated.
Definitely. You had these border ruffians, pro-slavery Missourians constantly crossing into Kansas to vote illegally in territorial elections to intimidate free state settlers. They managed to elect a pro-slavery legislature in 1855 based in Lecompton.
But the anti-slavery settlers didn't accept that.
No way. They called it fraudulent, set up their own rival government in Topeka. So now you have two governments claiming legitimacy. It's a recipe for disaster.
And violence erupts.
In 1856, a pro-slavery posse rode into the Free State town of Lawrence, smashed printing presses, burned buildings. It wasn't a huge massacre, but it was a significant attack.
And this connects to violence even in Washington.
Directly. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a blistering two-day speech called The Crime Against Kansas, denouncing the pro-slavery actions and personally insulting some Southern senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina.
And Butler's relative took exception.
His nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, also from South Carolina, felt Sumner had insulted his family honor. A few days later, Brooks walked into the Senate chamber and brutally beat Sumner senseless with a heavy cane while Sumner was trapped at his desk.
A shocking event.
Horrific. Sumner was severely injured, out of the Senate for years. Brooks became a hero in the South. People sent him new canes. In the North, it was seen as proof of Southern barbarity, the slave power resorting to violence even in Congress. It became a huge symbol.
And back in Kansas, the violence escalated further.
Oh, yes. Just days after Sumner was caned, the radical abolitionist John Brown decided on retaliation for the sack of Lawrence. He and a small group of followers dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their cabins along Pottawatomie Creek and hacked them to death with broadswords.
The Pottawatomie Massacre.
Yes, absolutely brutal. It triggered a full-scale guerrilla war in Kansas throughout 1856. Raids, ambushes, killings on both sides. Bleeding Kansas indeed.
And the political maneuvering over Kansas statehood just kept going. The Lecompton Constitution.
Right. In 1857, the pro-slavery government in Lecompton drafted a state constitution. It was cleverly worded. Voters couldn't vote against the Constitution itself, only for the Constitution with slavery or with no slavery. But even the no-slavery version protected the rights of existing slaveholders in Kansas.
So slavery would remain regardless.
Pretty much guaranteed. The Free State majority boycotted the vote entirely in protest. But President Buchanan, desperate to appease the South and end the Kansas turmoil, actually endorsed the Lecompton Constitution and urged Congress to admit Kansas as a slave state under it.
Even Stephen Douglas opposed that.
Yes. To his credit, Douglas broke with Buchanan. He argued the Lecompton Constitution violated true popular sovereignty because the people hadn't had a fair vote on the whole thing. This fight ripped the Democratic Party apart.
So what happened with Lecompton?
Congress ultimately sent it back to Kansas for a properly supervised popular vote. This time, the Free Staters participated and overwhelmingly rejected it. Kansas wouldn't become a state until 1861, after the South had seceded and it came in as a free state. But the Lecompton fight fatally wounded the Democratic Party as a national force.
Amidst all this Kansas turmoil, there was another presidential election in 1856.
Yes. The Democrats ditched Pierce and Douglas, who were too tied to the Kansas mess, and nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. He was experienced, seen as safe, and had conveniently been out of the country as ambassador to Britain during the Kansas-Nebraska fight. His platform endorsed popular sovereignty.
And the Republicans, their first presidential run.
First time out, they nominated John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, famous explorer. Their platform was clear. No expansion of slavery into the territories, free soil, free speech, and Fremont.
And there was a third party, too.
The American Party, or the Know-Nothings. They were mainly focused on anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment. They nominated former President Millard Fillmore. They tried to offer an alternative to the sectional conflict by focusing on nativism.
How did it turn out?
Buchanan won. He carried the entire South plus a few key northern states like Pennsylvania and Illinois. But Fremont did remarkably well, winning most of the North. It showed the Republicans were a serious force. Southern threats to secede if Fremont won likely scared some Northern voters into backing Buchanan to preserve the Union.
The divisions were just getting starker.
Absolutely. The 1856 election map looks very much like the 1860 map that preceded secession.
Then, just after Buchanan takes office in 1857, the Supreme Court drops a bombshell, the Dred Scott decision.
Dred Scott v. Sanford, probably the most infamous Supreme Court decision in U.S. history. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner had taken him to live for several years in free territory, Illinois and Wisconsin territory, before returning to Missouri. Scott sued for his freedom based on his time on free soil.
What did the court decide?
Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a former slaveholder from Maryland, delivered the majority opinion. It was sweeping. First, they ruled that Dred Scott, as a black man, was not considered a citizen under the Constitution when it was written, and therefore had no right to sue in federal court.
Just that would have been controversial enough.
But Taney didn't stop there. He went on to declare that enslaved people were private property, protected by the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. And therefore, Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any federal territory. It meant the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been unconstitutional all along, even though Kansas-Nebraska had already repealed it. It essentially meant slavery was legally permissible in all federal territory.
How did people react? This must have caused an uproar.
Massive uproar in the North. Republicans were outraged. It struck at the heart of their platform. Even Northern Democrats like Douglas were furious because it seemed to invalidate his popular sovereignty doctrine, too. If Congress couldn't ban slavery, could a territorial legislature? The South, of course, generally celebrated the ruling. They saw it as the highest court confirming their view of property rights and the limits of federal power. But it just convinced more Northerners that a slave power conspiracy controlled the government, including the Supreme Court.
Adding to the turmoil, 1857 also saw an economic crash.
Yes, the Panic of 1857. It wasn't as deep or long as some others, but the timing was significant. It was caused by things like overspeculation in railroads and land, inflation from California gold, interruption of grain exports due to the end of the Crimean War.
Who did it hit hardest?
It hit the North much harder than the South. Businesses failed, unemployment rose, especially in industrial centers. The South, with its cotton-based economy, weathered it relatively well.
What were the political effects?
It reinforced Southern confidence in their economic system. Cotton is king. In the North, it increased demands for things the South opposed. Higher protective tariffs to help industry, and free homesteads, 160 acres of Western land for settlers. Both of these became key planks in the Republican platform for 1860.
Okay, the next year, 1858, brings us the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. What was the context?
It was the Illinois Senate race. Stephen Douglas, the incumbent Democrat, was running for re-election. Abraham Lincoln, the rising Republican star, challenged him. Lincoln kicked off his campaign with his famous House Divided speech.
A house divided against itself cannot stand.
Exactly. He argued the nation couldn't permanently endure half slave and half free. It set a stark tone. They agreed to a series of 7 debates across Illinois.
These debates became nationally important.
Hugely important. Newspapers across the country covered them. Lincoln's strategy was to corner Douglas on the contradiction between popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision.
How did he do that?
Most famously, at the debate in Freeport, Lincoln asked Douglas directly, "Can the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery before forming a state constitution, given the Dred Scott ruling?"
Tricky question for Douglas.
Very tricky. If he said yes, he defied the Supreme Court and angered the South. If he said no, he effectively killed popular sovereignty and alienated Northern Democrats.
So was his answer, the Freeport Doctrine?
Yes. Douglas essentially said, well, maybe slavery is legally allowed, according to Dred Scott, but the people of a territory can still effectively keep it out by simply refusing to pass local police regulations, slave codes necessary to protect slave property. Without those local laws, slavery couldn't thrive.
A clever workaround.
It was clever, and it probably helped him win re-election in Illinois, but it absolutely infuriated Southern Democrats. They saw it as a betrayal, a way to cheat them out of the rights Dred Scott supposedly guaranteed. It deepened the split in the Democratic Party irrevocably.
And Lincoln?
Lincoln lost the Senate. Race senators were chosen by the state legislature then, and the Democrats kept control. But the debates made him a national figure, a leading contender for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860.
The very next year, 1859, John Brown returns to the scene, this time at Harper's Ferry.
Yes. John Brown, the same man from Pottawatomie Creek, he'd become convinced that only violence could end slavery. He hatched a plan to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia.
What was the goal?
The immediate goal was weapons. He hoped to arm enslaved people in the area, spark a massive slave rebellion that would spread throughout the South, and create a new free state in the Appalachian Mountains. He had secret financial backing from some prominent Northern abolitionists, the Secret Six.
How did the raid go?
It was a disaster. Brown and his small band, only about 20 men, including several of his sons, captured the arsenal easily on October 16, 1859. But the local militia quickly pinned them down. No slave uprising occurred. Federal troops, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, arrived, stormed the engine house where Brown was trapped, and captured him. Several of Brown's men, including 2 sons, were killed.
Brown was captured, tried, and executed.
Yes. He was tried very quickly in Virginia for treason, murder, and inciting insurrection. He was found guilty and hanged in December 1859. He conducted himself with considerable dignity during the trial and facing execution, becoming a martyr figure for many.
How did the North and South react differently this time?
The reactions were incredibly polarized. In the North, many moderates condemned Brown's violence. But abolitionists and many others hailed him as a hero who died fighting slavery. Emerson famously called him a new saint. Bells tolled in some northern towns on his execution day.
And the South?
Absolute terror and outrage. Brown's raids seemed to confirm their deepest fears. That Northerners were plotting violent abolition, encouraging slaves to murder them in their beds. They saw Brown as a murderer and terrorist, and the Northern sympathy for him was horrifying. It led directly to the strengthening of Southern militias, the beginnings of what would become the Confederate Army. Harper's Ferry was a point of no return for many Southerners.
It really seems like by 1860, the bridges were burned. Which brings us to the nominating conventions for the presidential election. The Democratic Party just implodes.
Completely shatters. They first met in Charleston, South Carolina. The Northern Democrats, led by Douglas supporters, wanted a platform endorsing popular sovereignty. The Southern Fire Eaters demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories. They couldn't agree. Delegates from 8 Southern states walked out.
So they couldn't nominate anyone.
Not in Charleston. They adjourned and tried again in Baltimore. More fights, another walkout. The remaining Northern Democrats finally nominated Stephen Douglas. But the Southern Democrats held their own rival convention, also in Baltimore, and nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, Buchanan's vice president, on a platform demanding federal protection for slavery everywhere.
So 2 Democratic candidates.
2 official Democratic candidates, splitting the party vote, and then a 4th party emerged, the Constitutional Union Party.
Who were they?
Mostly former Whigs and know-nothings, mainly from the border states. They wanted to ignore the slavery issue altogether and just focus on preserving the Constitution and the Union. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee.
A very fractured field. Then the Republicans meet in Chicago. Who was expected to win their nomination?
William Seward, the senator from New York, was widely seen as the frontrunner. He was the most prominent Republican leader, but he also had a long record, had made some enemies, and was maybe seen as too radical, too associated with that higher law talk and the irrepressible conflict speech.
So Lincoln emerges.
Lincoln played it perfectly. He was seen as more moderate than Seward, despite his strong stance against slavery's expansion. He was from the crucial Midwest. His House-divided speech was powerful, but maybe less alarming than Seward's rhetoric. His humble origins played well. The convention managers did a great job. Lincoln won the nomination on the 3rd ballot.
What was the Republican platform in 1860? It wasn't just about slavery, was it?
No, it was cleverly designed to appeal broadly across the North. The main plank was absolutely no extension of slavery into the territories. But it also included support for a protective tariff, appealing to manufacturers, no abridgment of rights for immigrants, countering the know-nothings, federal aid for a Pacific Railroad, government funding for internal improvements, and free homesteads, something for almost everyone in the North.
Did the South issue warnings about Lincoln's election?
Loud and clear warnings. Southern leaders openly stated that if Lincoln, a purely sectional candidate whose party aimed to restrict slavery, was elected, the South would secede. Lincoln himself didn't campaign much, stayed relatively quiet, letting the platform speak for itself.
So the election of 1860 happens. What's the result?
Lincoln wins the presidency, but it's a purely sectional victory. He wins nearly every free state, giving him a clear majority in the Electoral College. but he only gets about 40% of the total popular vote nationwide. His name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states.
How did the votes break down elsewhere?
Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, carried most of the Deep South. Bell, the constitutional unionist, won 3 border states: Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. Douglas, despite coming second in the popular vote, only won Missouri and part of New Jersey. The map showed a nation starkly divided.
But did Lincoln's election immediately mean the South lost all power?
No, not technically. Southerners still controlled both houses of Congress. The Supreme Court was still dominated by Southern sympathizers. Taney was still Chief Justice. A Republican president couldn't immediately abolish slavery where it existed or override Southern power in Congress.
But for the Deep South, his election was the last straw.
It was the signal. South Carolina, which had threatened secession for decades, acted immediately. They called a convention, and in December 1860, they voted unanimously to secede from the Union.
And others followed quickly.
Yes, during the lame duck period before Lincoln even took office in March 1861, 6 other Deep South states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also seceded.
They formed the Confederacy.
In February 1861, delegates from these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, formed the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as their provisional president.
What was President Buchanan doing while all this was happening?
Not much. He argued he had no constitutional authority to force a state to stay in the Union. He also blamed abolitionists for the crisis. His cabinet was full of Southerners or sympathizers. The army was small and scattered. He basically hoped for a peaceful resolution, but took no strong action to prevent secession.
Was his inaction, maybe, helpful in a strange way?
Ironically, perhaps. If he'd acted forcefully, it might have pushed the crucial border states, like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, into seceding much earlier alongside the Deep South. His delay kept them in the Union for a time.
Why did those southern states ultimately decide to leave? What were the core reasons?
It boils down to slavery. Fear that the political balance had tipped against them permanently. Fear that the Republican Party, even if it only came to restrict slavery's expansion now, would eventually move to abolish it everywhere. Anger over decades of perceived Northern aggression, abolitionist criticism, personal liberty laws, John Brown.
Economic factors, too.
Some belief that secession would allow them to pursue their own economic interests, lower tariffs, direct trade with Europe. Also, a belief, mistaken as it turned out, that the North wouldn't fight to keep them, that secession would be peaceful. And finally, this idea of states' rights and self-determination, the idea that they had voluntarily joined the Union and could voluntarily leave.
Was there one last attempt at compromise even after secession began? The Crittenden Amendments.
Yes, a final, desperate effort led by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. He proposed several constitutional amendments.
What was the main proposal?
The heart of it was to reestablish the Missouri Compromise line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes, for all remaining territories and any acquired in the future. Slavery would be protected south of that line, prohibited north of it. States would still decide for themselves when admitted.
Slavery guaranteed south of the line forever.
That was the idea. It also included amendments protecting slavery in the states where it existed and upholding the fugitive slave law.
How did Lincoln react to this? He was president-elect by now.
Lincoln rejected it. Specifically, he rejected the part about allowing slavery to expand into any new territory south of the line. That went against the core principle on which he and the Republican Party had been elected: no further extension of slavery. With Lincoln's opposition, the Crittenden Compromise failed. The last chance for a political solution was gone.
So, looking back over this whole period, 1848 to 1860, it really feels like a relentless slide into conflict. What are the main takeaways?
I think the overwhelming takeaway is the centrality of slavery. It wasn't the only issue, but it infused and poisoned everything else: westward expansion, economic policy, political power. Every attempt to compromise ultimately failed because neither side could concede on the fundamental issue of slavery's future. Polarization just grew and grew.
And those key moments we discussed: the Mexican Cession, popular sovereignty's failure, the fugitive slave law, Kansas, Nebraska, Dred Scott, John Brown. They all link together, don't they? Each one building on the last, ratcheting up the tension.
Absolutely. It wasn't one single event. It was a chain reaction, a cascade of crises that eroded trust, broke down political norms, and made peaceful resolution seem impossible by 1860.
It really does feel like the political system itself was breaking down under the strain.
It couldn't contain the conflict. The compromises worked temporarily, but they didn't solve the underlying problem, and eventually the whole structure collapsed.
Okay, here's a final thought for you, the listener.
to chew on. Thinking about all these moments, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas, Nebraska, Dred Scott, Lincoln's election, was there one specific point where the path to war became truly unavoidable? Or was it a gradual accumulation? And why that point? Could any realistic alternative path have been taken looking back? Something to ponder. We really encourage you to explore these events and people further. It's such a critical and tragic period in American history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.